Welcome everyone to Making the Most of Your Vestry Retreat with Nathan Kirkpatrick. I am delighted that you're here and thank you for taking the time out this evening to participate in this webinar. My name is Brendan Hunter and the lights have gone out in this room, which I need to turn back on. I'm joining you from our office, ECS office in New York City, and just want to give everyone a quick introduction to the Episcopal Church Foundation if you're not already familiar with us. Real fast, ECF is an independent lay-led organization. We were founded in 1949 by then presiding Bishop Henry Knox Shale. Our mission is to empower Episcopal congregations, dioceses, and other Episcopal organizations in their financial leadership and strategic development. We do this through a variety of programs, including our publication, ECF Vital Practices and Vestry Papers, Vital Themes for Lay Clergy Partnerships, the Fellowship Partners Program for supporting emerging academics and ministry leaders within the church, our variety of financial and strategic offerings, including endowment management services, capital campaigns, and time giving. You can check that all out on our website. There are some web links on the left-hand side of your screen. And would encourage you as well to just take a quick look at what we do through our programs for building up healthy, vital, and vibrant businesses. Further ado, I will hand over to Kirkpatrick. Thank you again for joining us. And also we'll just note that we'll be monitoring the chat box so that if you do have any questions, if we haven't taken a pause for that, go ahead and ask them. I'll make sure that Nathan gets around to getting to your questions. And before I forget, two other technical notes as well. This is being recorded so that it will be made available later for you and others to be able to watch. So just bear that in mind as well with the types of questions that you are asking. And copies of the PowerPoint slides are available to download at this moment. You can do so on the left-hand side of your screen in this files box. Or if you'd rather download them later, all participants will receive an email following this presentation with a link to the recording and copies of the slides that should come out within the next couple of days after this. So again, thanks again for joining us and take it away.
Thanks, Brendan. Really grateful to see all of you here tonight. Again, my name is Nathan Kirkpatrick. I'm the Managing Director of Alban at Duke Divinity School and Leadership Education at Duke Divinity School. And for the last 11 years, it's been my privilege to work with congregational, institutional, and denominational leaders, both in the United States and around the world, trying to shore up the quality of leadership offered in parishes, in dioceses, and in other institutions. And through my work here, I've had the privilege of being connected with ECF, and glad to share this time with all of you. What keeps me accountable in this work is that alongside it, I am the priest associate at my parish in Chapel Hill. And so that which I say on the road, I have to go home and practice. And it's that vibrant back and forth between doing it out and advising others and then actually practicing it myself that keeps me both, I hope, humble, but also aware of what it is that the church is confronting today. As we gather tonight, I would invite us to begin with a word of prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Almighty God, we give you thanks that you have continued to call servant leaders, that you continue to call people who lead sacrificially, but even more so, we're grateful that you called those persons to periods of refreshment and renewal, to seasons of rest and relaxation, in order that they might be rejuvenated to continue to serve you, your church, and your world. We pray that in this time together, we might think about how best to orchestrate, to design those events which provide for our soul's healing and opportunities to encounter your grace, mercy, and love, so that we might be instruments of your peace in this world. For Christ's sake we pray. Amen. Hopefully you've had a chance to post an answer to this question. We'll be coming back to this question again and again throughout our time together. To let you know, our evening is going to be divided into 3 movements. The first movement is really to talk about why a vestry retreat at all. Why is it we would dedicate the energy, effort, time, money to actually providing this kind of opportunity? And we'll spend some time talking about good reasons to have a vestry retreat and some not so good reasons to have a vestry retreat. Then, after taking some questions from you, if you have them, we'll turn to movement 2, asking really, what can we accomplish in a vestry retreat? And a preview of coming attractions, the answer to that is always less than what we imagine. And that's actually a sign of grace. And so we'll spend some time talking about how much can we reasonably do in a vestry retreat in that kind of format, and how to make the most of that time. So we'll talk about design, and then also we'll talk about how to incorporate the varieties of gifts of vestry members. And then in our third movement tonight, we'll talk about how we can evaluate a vestry retreat and how it is that the evaluation of a vestry retreat actually provides our parishes with a model of evaluating other ministry areas and other ministry programs, so that it can serve sort of double duty. It's both training and evaluation for our lay and clergy leaders, but it's also an opportunity for us to get helpful feedback as we go into our next cycle of vestry retreats. So let's begin. Why a vestry retreat? Most of the time when I receive this question, what I hear is, well, because we have one. And what I tend to hear is, well, it's the place we do all the work that we can never get to otherwise. It's the thing we do, which is a little bit, it's not a little bit, it is problematic, because what it does is it sets up sort of a Maslow's hammer kind of phenomenon, that if all we have is a vestry retreat, then the whole world looks like a nail. And so part of what we have to think about is this intentional, deliberate decision about what is our goal for the vestry retreat. And so the decision to have a vestry retreat begins with a needs assessment process. It begins with clarity around what it is we hope to achieve in and through this time. In many ways, it's the Stephen Covey principle of beginning with the end in mind. What is it we want people to walk away from at the end of the vestry retreat? What is it we hope that if all our wishes and dreams and prayers for this time are fulfilled, what is it we hope would happen? And it begins first and foremost with a personal aspirational question. What is it you hope to accomplish during the retreat? What is it that you need? Is either a vestry member or the rector or the vicar, what is it you need to come away from this retreat having? What is it that you as vestry members together need? Clarity around answering this question actually sets the vestry retreat off to a good start even before it begins. There are lots of different ways you can ascertain this information. One of the simplest is actually dedicating time in a previous vestry meeting to talking about what it is you hope you will achieve through the vestry retreat. This isn't a time to stack the agenda per se. It is a time, though, to actually talk about what you need, what you deeply need as a vestry and as an individual vestry member. But the question isn't just to the vestry members. The second question in any needs assessment process is, what is it that the parish needs to have happen during this time? What is it that the parish needs from us that we can actually begin to accomplish through our vestry retreat? Now here, one of the simplest ways to do this is just starting to ask, to open up the conversation. Your vestry goes on retreat annually. What is it you would hope we would do during that time? When I've asked that question in the past, what I usually hear is that congregations are much more concerned about spiritual vitality of the vestry, that people who serve on the vestry aren't burning out, are actually finding ways of being renewed themselves for leadership within the parish. They're actually much more concerned about knowing that the church is well cared for spiritually, than they are necessarily about the strategic priorities for the church. But there are other answers to these questions. And over time, what I have heard is that these answers fall, generally speaking, in three categories. The first is that a vestry retreat provides a vestry with an opportunity to talk about who we are and how we will work well together. In many ways, in this way, the vestry retreat serves as team building, as relationship cultivation. And right now in the church year, when many of our vestries have new members on them, this is an essential function of the vestry retreat, getting to know one another. Beyond just passing in the halls on Sunday morning, how is it that we are going to be together in this work that lies before us? How is it that we will behave together? What are our priorities for the relationships that we share in the year ahead? Getting clear about that. You see I use the phrase DTR there. That means define the relationship. In many ways, young couples have to do this. Organizations and vestries and boards have to do this. We have to define how we will be together and how we will conduct our business together. And a vestry retreat makes a great opportunity to talk about personal values, about commitments, about what we deeply hope for our work together, and then also what we deeply fear. And giving people the opportunity to voice both concern and commitment during a vestry retreat makes a lot of sense. For returning vestry members too, it's not just for new vestry members. For returning vestry members, a vestry retreat provides them with a new beginning. It provides them with an opportunity to say at the beginning of this new year, this is how I hope we will work together even with what I have experienced, or in spite of what I've experienced, or because of what I've experienced. It lets everybody begin on a clean sheet, basically. If that's the first reason why a number of congregations have a vestry retreat, the second is really about goal setting and prioritizing. And this is, again, a great use for a vestry retreat. Vestry retreats can provide you with the opportunity to define strategic priorities for the year ahead and assign responsibilities for executing against them. You can define those one or two things that you really want to accomplish in the year before you. And you can decide who on the vestry's gifts best meet the challenges and the opportunities before you, which is close to the second element of this. You can develop a plan to address one or two significant opportunities or challenges in the year ahead, for example, capital campaigns, physical plant renovations, ministry to and with the community. Vestry retreats provide you an opportunity to delve into those kinds of questions and into those kinds of issues that take longer, as you know, than what one Tuesday night can accomplish. Also, it can spark new strategies for a problem, opportunity, and challenge. It's hard to replace the brainstorming that is possible at a vestry retreat on any given Tuesday or Monday night. A vestry retreat provides you a great opportunity to be together and say, there's no judgment, but if we could do anything, what would we do? What does the community need from us? And then all of a sudden you're finding new strategies for familiar problems, opportunities, or challenges. The third area that I often hear as a reason for vestry retreats is a vestry needs to accomplish other important work. Here, oftentimes I hear vestries want to do a mutual ministry review or some sort of clergy evaluation or some sort of wholesale ministry evaluation. One note on that, it's a fine use of a vestry retreat, but just be aware that that's a tone-setting activity. That if you begin or include an evaluative piece that's not an evaluation of the vestry retreat itself, what you often end up with is you've set the norm, either to critique or to compliment, but you've defined a tone for being together. And that can be somewhat limiting to the overall goal of the vestry retreat. You can also accomplish a longer conversation about substantive questions than what's normally possible. And here, we'll talk more about this in movement 2. but it's important that those substantive questions come to us in ways that are actually generative rather than actually closed. So we want questions that keep opening up horizons for the vestry rather than questions that start narrowing our prospects or actually constraining our vision. And then, I know at least one of you mentioned this, a vestry retreat makes a great opportunity to learn from an outside presenter, to bring someone in who's doing work that you care about or who's doing ministry in a field that you find compelling, and to actually spend some time with that person and receive both their wisdom, but then also their questions, their concerns, their challenges, their stories of failures. Those are all good things that can be accomplished during a vestry retreat. Now let's go back to that question I asked in the beginning. Think back to the most beneficial vestry retreat. What made it beneficial? Did what I just described take place? Was there some element of either defining who you are and how you'll be together? Was there some element about goal setting, prioritizing? Was there some element of other important work? I hope so. Todd's commenting. I hope those things are present. If not, I'm happy to amend my theory, but at least for now, those seem to be the most common kinds of work that make a vestry retreat an important event in the life of a parish during the year. Now, all of this, frankly, has to be undergirded with a spiritual frame. All of this has to be undergirded with some sort of prayer, worship, attention to the spiritual lives of our vestry members. In fact, when is it a bad idea to have a vestry retreat? Well, first, when you're not going to do that. If you're actually just looking for a business meeting, the vestry retreat isn't the forum for it. If what you're looking for is an opportunity to just take care of the budget or to fret, this is not it. But if the vestry retreat can be an opportunity when you can actually attend to one another as disciples too, and to pay attention to what's happening in people's spiritual lives, then it can actually be a healing opportunity within a life of service. It can be an opportunity in which people find themselves drawn closer to Christ through this service, rather than this service being something disconnected from their life of discipleship and prayer. The second time when a vestry retreat is a bad idea is when what you really want to do is just have one really long vestry meeting. If what you really want to do is take the agenda from any other night and actually spend 3 hours or 4 hours kicking it around, this is not the time to have a vestry retreat. No one wants to attend that meeting, and in fact what you'll end up with is souls depleted rather than renewed and refreshed. And so if what you want is really a long vestry meeting, fine. Pick a Sunday afternoon, set the time aside, say we need more time for this conversation. But if what you're looking to the retreat to supply is this agenda, then that's not it. No one leaves happy. I can promise you that. Third, and this perhaps is the most critical, if what you really want to do is just continue well-worn patterns of engaging each other over conflictual issues within the life of the parish, and what you're really just looking for is a longer fight, a vestry retreat is by far a mistake. It is not the place to just have a protracted disagreement. We'll talk in just a minute about how to deal with contentious issues in vestry retreats and where to place them within the overall agenda. But if what you're dealing with is a parish in conflict, a vestry retreat will not heal you. It may actually just take the conflict and move it to different terrain. And so part of the question, if you are in your parish are confronting any of these three things, If you're not interested in attending the spiritual life and practices, if what you really need is a long meeting, or if you really just want to have a fight, this is the time to consult with an outside facilitator one-on-one. This is the point to bring in an outside person who can come alongside you and say, all right, those are meaningful in your context, but there are other ways of actually doing these that might achieve better aims. And just because you have a Vestry retreat scheduled doesn't mean that this should be the agenda for it. I'm going to pause here for a minute and take any questions you might have around why a Vestry retreat at this point.
I'm going to invite everyone to use the chat box in the lower right-hand side of your screen to type in your questions. And as it looks like we have someone typing in a question at the moment, we'll just remind everyone as well that if you have any questions at any point, if we haven't paused for questions, to please go ahead and put those into the chat box. I'll be monitoring it to make sure that Nathan gets around to your questions at later points within the presentation. So you can always take advantage of that throughout the webinar.
So I do want to pick up quickly. I've caught up in my chat box reading with Ted's question, what is God doing and how are we participating? That's a critical question. And when we come to design, making sure people have the opportunity to voice how they hear God working is crucial. Kate, great question. My problem, you want to build relationships, set goals, and review last year all in the same retreat. Too much? Well, let's say this. If what you can do is have every element of your retreat do some double duty, you can do it all. But if what you're trying to do is do each of those things in turn, the danger is what people will feel is 2 to 3 hours of icebreakers, then a hard shift to evaluation, and then a hard shift to setting goals. And so part of the question becomes, how do we actually layer experiences during a Vestry retreat with multiple meanings? And so, for example, even how do we get the introductions to serve double duty? For example, tell us your name and how did you find your way to this parish? Which begins to tell us about how we're connected to the community, which might begin to help us setting goals. And then later on, when we talk about evaluation or reviewing last year, one of the ways we could do it is actually inviting people to bring pictures of when was this parish at its best. Bring either a real picture of that or bring some description of it. And then, so what you would want to do is actually then be able to show, not only is this a time when we were at our best, but this is also telling us something about who we are, who we're called to be, and how we're living most faithfully into that mission. Yes, Phil, you're exactly right. Type 3, oftentimes what you need is conflict intervention rather than a retreat. So, yes. Well, again, please continue to ask questions, and if I missed your question, I apologize. We'll come back and make sure that they all get answered at the end. But we do want to turn to the second movement. What can we accomplish? And across my time here at Duke, one of the great privileges of my work is I've gotten to work with some really interesting designers of events and learning events for adults. And part of what I've learned from working with them here and then also with the Center for Courage and Renewal, which is the institutional branch of Parker Palmer's work, are a few basic principles of design. And what I really want to do is share them with you and then engage you with how do these feel to you. First of all, first basic principle of design, you have less time than you think you do. It doesn't matter how much time you have allocated, you have less time than you think you do. In part, in part because what you have Can you hear me?
Are you with us?
Can you hear me?
We can still hear you. Looks like the video stream may have cut out.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm trying to reconnect. So generally, when you design an event and you think about the time that you have, oftentimes one mistake people make is that they actually book the entire time. And part of what becomes very important is that you give breathing space around the edges and that you designate a primary goal and then a secondary goal and make sure that everything that you do does double duty. So that in fact, what you're building is you are building events and experiences that actually that help people in a variety of ways engage the most important and most meaningful questions before your vestry. So closely related to this principle of you have less time than you think you do is this next this next principle of design, which is actually that less is more. And here, what we want to think about is the intentionally designed, intentionally chosen less is more. So that what we have are some well-chosen pieces around which we can design a whole event and design an entire retreat for people. And thank you, Brendan, for advancing that slide. And if we can advance one more. So what we really want to do in this situation is we want to pay attention to the arc. In every learning event, part of what group dynamics teaches us, but also what we know about individual behavior within events and within groups, is that there's an arc to that. That there's an important arc for us to know and observe, for us to be attentive to in our placement of conversations and in our ultimate design of the event. And so what we want to think about is how we move people from cool to warmer, to warm-hot, to hot-warm, to cooler, to cool. What we want to think about is how we move people from the less personal to the more personal, to the perhaps very personal, and then back to less personal, and back to basically just familiar. Likewise, another way of reading this arc would be to take people from a place of where we talk on the one hand about generally agreed upon issues, the cool, and then start moving people into questions where maybe there's a little bit of disagreement, but there's still generally, there's still generally agreement. And then we can move people to more contentious questions. We can move people to more disagreement in the middle of the event. So when we move people to roughly halfway through, we can actually have some serious disagreements as a vestry. But then we also don't want to end on that place. What we want to do is then give people a place where they can actually feel deeply connected to one another again. And then from that experience, from being deeply connected, they can also then go back out confident that what we're working on is really, we're all working toward the same goal. We're all working in the same direction. So if your retreat, for example, begins on Friday night, we might think about these cool to warmer activities, introductions, evening prayer, which is a warmer activity all taking place evening into morning. By mid-morning, the group will actually be ready for some serious discussion, for some goal setting where there's perhaps some disagreement, or some evaluation where there may be different opinions about what went on last year. Then we want to move the group back to a place where there's general agreement again. And so that's the learning arc that we want to pay attention to. And as you're thinking about when certain questions should come before your vestry, or what kinds of activities you should do with your vestry on retreat, you want to pay attention to how people engage each other, and to trust that part of what you're doing is relationship building. And if you start too hot, what you end up with is setting up sides or camps. You end up setting up disagreements. And so what we don't want to do is begin with something that feels conflictual and then have nowhere to go. Now, through this, across this arc, there are 4 elements that really should be present in any kind of vestry retreat, in my opinion. The first is a real attention to spiritual practice. That part of this should be that renewal of the individuals who comprise your vestry. The second thing, and this takes place early on in your retreat, is that you define how it is that you will be together for this retreat period. That you will define how you will be together through using something we call in our office boundary markers, what the Center for Courage and Renewal calls touchstones, what you may have experienced elsewhere as being called ground rules, which is my least favorite way to name these. Whatever you choose to call them, you need some basic touchstones, basic boundary markers in place to define how it is that in this space and in this time you will be together. I've included an example in your files section on the main page here in Adobe Connect. And you can download those. Those are adapted from the Center for Courage and Renewal, and I find them very helpful. For example, they include things like as fully present as possible, encouraging people to set aside cell phones if they can. It encourages people to, when the going gets rough, turn to wonder, which is a great practice when we're disagreeing with one another. How do I make my disagreement with you a question? And how do I hold the space for this so that I can figure out what it means that we might be having this disagreement? There are boundary markers like share the air. If you have vestry members who are prone to talk too much, this is a way of inviting them to actually share the air with one another. I just turn your attention to that document, though, as an example of one thing that you could do. The third element that really should be present that you can accomplish reasonably in any length of vestry retreat is an efficient agenda that pays attention to multiple intelligences and personality preferences. Oftentimes when I've participated in vestry retreats, what I've observed is that the more extroverted, more external processors are pretty quick to jump into conversation, but those of us who are more internal processors never quite get an opportunity to participate. And so part of what you want to think about in designing a vestry retreat is how is it you provide space for some people who may need longer times to come up with their answers or their ideas, with time and space for reflection. A great tool here is to actually give people either journals or notebooks and invite people to take 20 minutes and write what are the goals that you would have this church do, or when were we at our best, and what would it look like if we continue doing things like that into the future. And you give people some serious time to contemplate that. Then recognizing not everyone, even those on vestries, are comfortable speaking in larger groups, inviting people to pair and share, or to get into triads, and share in a smaller conversation, and then have a plenary conversation about what you've heard. the entire group together. What did you do in your small group conversations? This is a way of culling the wisdom of the room without putting any one person on the spot. It's a generous gift of hospitality in the space. Likewise, when we pay attention, if that's personality preferences, when we pay attention to multiple intelligences, part of what we need to think about is not always going at the questions that are before us in the most direct way. So here, how can we use music, art? How can we use movies or theater? How can we use creative media to actually enable people to voice that which they know? One of the surprises to me about my job here is that most of the time what I have to do is give people an excuse to claim what they already know. What I have to do is help people articulate it and find words for it. But oftentimes when I come into a congregation, when I meet with a rector, they already know the answer. They already know the terrain and the landscape. They need somebody to help them actually articulate it maybe in fresh ways. So using media, using creative things, using unpredictable things actually invites people to name what they know in new ways. One of the questions I love to ask a congregation is, if this congregation was a type of transportation, what would it be? I asked a congregation in Indiana that question, and the response to me, one person on the vestry said this: we would be an Indy car going around the track as fast as we can. Another person said, we would be Moses' sandals, stuck in the wilderness for 40 years. Now, what's fascinating about those two metaphors is while on the surface they sound different, they both point to something really profound about what's happening in the life of the congregation as those two people are experiencing it. If I had asked them directly, so how are things at your church? I'm not sure I would have heard from them either the sense that we're spinning too fast and we're just going around in a circle keeping the car in the lines, or we're in the wilderness and I'm not sure when we're making it to the promised land. But by inviting people into metaphor, they could name what they knew but couldn't articulate. So I'd encourage you to pay attention to multiple intelligences, personality preferences. And then last, and this is what we'll do in Movement 3, is no vestry retreat, in my opinion, is really complete without an evaluation. Evaluation is an underutilized tool in the church, and oftentimes what we do is we measure the inputs and not the outputs. And so we'll spend a few minutes talking about how can we evaluate vestry retreats in a way that that actually teaches us something about that's transferable to other areas in the life of the church. That was an awful lot, and because of the technical difficulties on my end, you may have questions. And so I'd like to pause here, and if you have questions, I'd love to hear them at this point. Or you can put them in the chat box. Looks like we have a couple people typing. Sure. Do you have good resource suggestions for the more creative media, metaphor ideas, etc.? Yes and no. There isn't one place where I recommend everyone goes. However, two great books. This one, Leading from Within, it's a collection of poems with introductions written. It's edited by Sam Intrater and Megan Scribner. And then the other is this book, Teaching with Fire, which is also a collection of poems with introductions written by people who are helpful in thinking about metaphor and thinking about how you can use things like poetry in creative ways to actually harvest wisdom. I can send out a list of music that I like to use, and then there's also something available through the Center for Courage and the Center for Creative Leadership called Visual Explorer, which is a collection of some 400 images or so, which actually invite people to choose an image that speaks to them about the life of their congregation or what's going on right now. Phil Casey, great question. Evaluation at the retreat or soon after? The answer to that is both, and we'll get back there. Yeah. So Everett, your question, we'll get back there too, about looping back to the expectations of the group and something larger. Any other questions about design for a retreat? All right. Well, let's turn to this question of evaluation for a parish vestry retreat. Here again, my conviction is that evaluation is an underutilized tool in parish life. And so part of what we want to do is we want to use the parish retreat, the vestry retreat, as an opportunity to practice. And here we want to do this in two ways. The first is through short-term evaluation. So this gets to Phil's question about at the retreat or soon after. We want to do short-term evaluation to get sort of harvest initial responses. And a quick and easy way of doing this is actually through a tool called Plus Delta. Some of you may be familiar with Plus Delta. Literally at the top of a rip chart piece of paper, on one side you put plus, and on the other side you draw the Greek letter delta. Under plus you list what worked well, and under the delta, what you wish had been different. It's very simple. One of the things that we have started doing here in our meetings, here at Leadership Education, is that this is our last practice in the meeting. That we do a quick evaluation where everybody in the room has to say one positive thing, what worked well for them, what helped them show up, what solution to a problem did the meeting help them find, and then also a delta. What we wish had been different about the meeting, whether that was we wish it had been in a different room, or something much more substantive like we wish there had been more time for conversation and less time actually spent with presentation, or whatever it may be. Plus Delta is a quick way to actually do some evaluation of a vestry retreat. It's really easy to do that on a rip chart as everybody is leaving. Another way to do it, it's a more complicated but more controlled way, is actually doing something through SurveyMonkey or any of the online survey providers. And here what we want to focus on are three things. Really, first of all, we want an appreciative question. One of the dangers of evaluation is we only hear what didn't go well, and we don't want that. We want some appreciative questions so that what we hear first and foremost from people is what did they benefit from? What did they glean? What did they gain? What is it that they learned from this vestry retreat and from this time together? And then second, we want to ask a constructive question. And here, it's important to differentiate between a constructive question about the retreat experience itself and a constructive question about my participation in the retreat itself. So one way to ask this hopefully and helpfully is, what did I need to do differently to make this retreat a better experience for me? In this way, part of what we're trying to harvest is what are the behaviors that already have started to surface within the vestry that may actually contribute to perhaps some unhelpful kinds of interactions with one another. So it's not just a question of what didn't go well, but it's also this question about how could I have shown up in a more constructive, in a better way. And then last, a personal question. whenever it asks about looping back to the expectations of the group, here's really where this question surfaces. If someone takes the risk, and it is a risk, to say what I need out of this time is to be vulnerable, or what I need out of this time is a chance to hear the mission and vision of this parish, because I'm a little unclear. If someone takes that risk, then this personal question is really, were your needs met? Based on your sacrifice of time and talent, what is it that I actually found on retreat and during this time? And if my needs were not met, how is it that I could have shown up differently? How is it this time could have been different? Ryla asks, do you have some samples of these kinds of SurveyMonkey questions we might consider? Absolutely. And I'm happy to email those out to you, in addition to the ones that I just offered. Because really keeping a balance within the SurveyMonkey is important. Much like the design arc overall, if you end an evaluation with a critical question, people will oftentimes be left with a more critical assessment in their mind of what actually happened than what necessarily went on and transpired during the retreat itself. That's a quick version of short-term evaluation, but there is this other piece, which is that when we're evaluating a vestry retreat, or we're evaluating any ministry within the life of the church, part of what we have to ask is the longitudinal evaluation. This is done at some distance from the experience itself, and really is about the staying power of it. In many of our programs here, we ask immediately following the program, tell us what you think. And then 3 months, 5 months, 6 months, even a year out, we ask people, what do you remember? And oftentimes, what's interesting is in these long-term evaluations, in these longitudinal evaluation questions, what we hear back is how they're integrating what they experienced with what they're doing in their day-to-day ministries. Now, the same thing is true in a vestry retreat. It is a great gift of grace to come away and feel renewed and inspired and enriched. It is a great thing to come away and feel like you have had that mountaintop experience. But the question is, 6 months later, when you're back in the throes of parish life, and you're having a vestry conversation, and things are not going well on the vestry, how is it that that mountaintop experience still echoes? So there are a couple of ways that you can do this kind of longitudinal evaluation. One is 3 to 5 months, 3 to 6 months after your vestry retreat. You're sitting in a vestry meeting. You can ask, was there something we did at our vestry retreat that actually might inform what's happening in the parish now? Is there something we did at the vestry retreat that should inform what's happening in the parish now? That's an easy way to do it. The harder way is to actually construct another SurveyMonkey kind of question, and actually ask people, what do you remember? And what's amazing is the way that they will integrate their own experience into the experience that they had while on the retreat itself. Here, if you have a design committee or a design group for the parish retreat, or if you're the rector in charge of putting it together, part of what you want to think about is how you will touch back and to keep looping back to these evaluations. What did we learn? What did we learn worked? What did we learn didn't work? What was appreciated? What could we have done better? And then to keep reminding the group, this is what we heard from you. Now, ultimately, part of the real gift of doing this kind of evaluation is that it does allow you to model these practices and then encourage vestry members to take them back into their own areas of ministry. What a great gift it would be if part of vestry conversation around ministries, program areas, became a question about what are you learning through your evaluation? Oftentimes when we think about evaluation, we think about it negatively. In this way, what I hope I'm trying to suggest is that what we're actually hoping for is that this is really constructive and that the vestry can learn from each other and actually provide better leadership and better ministry to the parish based on what they're learning in these kinds of feedback loops. But putting the feedback loop in place is actually the most difficult part. And then over time, facilitating those conversations comes more naturally when it becomes a practice of the vestry. What questions do you have about evaluation? All right, Phil's typing.
Again, I'd also just add that as we're approaching 8 o'clock as well, that if you have any other questions as well, invite you to also ask those at this time.
Hey, Phil asks a great question. Should this be on the agenda for the next meeting? It can be. Oftentimes, though, what you want to do is you want to either figure out if you're going to process the short-term evaluation at the retreat itself. If you're going to do that, it doesn't need to be on the agenda for the next meeting. But if what you're going to do is collect that information and then actually touch back to it in the next meeting, that can be a helpful practice. Overall, the question about both evaluation and then dealing with the feedback you receive in evaluation is a question about intentionality. Is there a reason for the decisions you're making? And if there isn't a reason for the decisions you're making, what's the problem? How can you be more intentional about making decisions about evaluation and the incorporation of feedback? Are there other questions? Thanks, Brendan.
And as I like to say, if you're holding a thought or a question, it is highly likely that someone else is too. Don't be shy. Go ahead and step it up and go ahead and ask that question. Or if you have any other comments as well about your experience on trying to lead a retreat, or if you've had particular successes with your retreats, if there's something that has worked especially well with you, I would love to hear your feedback as well. Again, we all benefit from each other's wisdom on this, so we'd love to hear any particular exercises that have worked really well for you. If you've used a metaphor exercise, for example, that would work particularly well, would love to hear that.
What time commitment, Everett asks, what time commitment should be given to the evaluation? It's a great question. If you're doing something simple like plus delta, I would give 10 minutes. And I would do it before you did whatever closing Eucharist or whatever closing event you actually did. In part, what you want to do is not end on the evaluation. If you're doing something more complex, generally speaking, with SurveyMonkey, we expect people to be able to respond to us within a week if you're doing something like that. And then when you're actually debriefing feedback, one thing that you can do is allocate between 10 minutes. 10 minutes is long. Between 7 and 10 minutes to discussing feedback. Part of the gift of touching back to feedback and going back and looking at what was said is then you can actually coach better feedback too. You can encourage people to, well, what did you hear? Well, how could this have been more constructive? So I do want to provide you with my contact information. I'm happy to be in touch with you if you have ongoing questions about vestry retreats, vestry planning, or if there are ways that Alban at Duke Divinity School can be helpful to you. I'm happy to be in touch with you in the future. So you see my email address there. I think I'm really lucky. I have one of the easiest email addresses at Duke, nek@duke.edu. And there's my telephone number, 919-613-5330. I'd love to be in touch with you to hear what it is that you're learning or what it is that you need.
Great. Thank you, Nathan. And just quickly before Brent closes out, I'd just also like to remind everyone that ECF has a bunch of other great webinars. We're just in the midst of putting up our second quarter webinars, so those will be posted soon, and we'll have an email out on that. But we do have several more that are scheduled with some other guest presenters. We are so delighted that Nathan from Alban at Duke Divinity School would join us this evening as a guest presenter. We have other guest presenters as well lined up, including Lisa Kimball and Kyle Oliver of the Center of the Ministry of Teaching at Virginia Theological Seminary on March 8th. Check it out on the ECF website. And on surveys and feedback, you will be getting a survey in your inbox very soon, probably next couple of minutes. So I encourage all of you to please go into your inbox and click on that survey link. We look at all of your feedback and really digest that and look at that for planning all of our future webinars and working with our guest presenters as well. We will share this feedback with Nathan as well. So please take a moment to do that. We really, really value that. Thank you, Nathan, for your wonderful expertise and sharing all of this great knowledge for us. Thank you to everyone who joined us this evening for taking the time out of your busy, busy schedules. Have a blessed Lenten season and Godspeed in your ministry. Have a good night.